For aircraft carriers burned on the ocean floor, and Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto could not explain why. The war room in Tokyo felt like a tomb. Officers stood around the great map table, but no one spoke. The pins marking the positions of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu had been removed. Those proud ships now rested 3 miles beneath the Pacific, along with 3,000 sailors who would never see Japan again. It was June 1942, and the Battle of Midway had turned the war upside down. Commander Takashi Kuroda watched from his station near the signals desk. He was not important enough to stand at the main table, but he was close enough to see the faces of powerful men breaking apart. The defeat made no sense. Japan had sent the greatest naval force ever assembled to capture a tiny island. They had superior numbers, better pilots, and complete surprise. And yet the Americans had been waiting. Their dive bombers had appeared at the exact moment when Japanese flight decks were covered with bombs and fuel. 5 minutes of fire had destroyed the heart of the Imperial Navy. Kuroda was a signals intelligence officer, trained to find patterns in chaos. His job was to intercept enemy radio traffic and search for meaning in the noise. He was quiet by nature, the kind of man who noticed small things that others missed. In the days after Midway, while admirals blamed each other and captains wrote reports full of excuses, Kuroda began collecting information. He read every after-action summary. He studied the timeline of the battle hour by hour. And slowly, a terrible thought began to form in his mind: the Americans had known, not guessed. Not been lucky. They had known exactly where the Japanese fleet would be, exactly when it would arrive, and exactly when its defenses would be weakest. Kuroda remembered a basic principle from his training: once is chance, twice is coincidence, 3 times is enemy action. At Midway, everything had gone wrong at once. That was not bad luck. That was information that he began searching through old intercepts, messages the Navy had captured from American radio traffic in the weeks before the battle. Most were routine military chatter, but one document caught his attention. It was a decoded American message that mentioned a target called AF. American intelligence was discussing an attack on AF and making preparations to defend it. At the time, Japanese analysts had dismissed it as unimportant. But Kuroda knew something that made his hands shake. In the Japanese Navy's own secret codes, AF was the designation for Midway Island. This was impossible. AF was an internal code, known only to Japanese officers. It appeared in encrypted messages sent on the JN-25 cipher system, which the Navy considered unbreakable. Yet here was an American message using the exact same designation. The only explanation was unbearable: the Americans were reading Japanese codes. Kuroda brought his findings to Captain Jiro Masuda, his immediate superior. Masuda was responsible for code security, a proud man who had assured the Naval General Staff that JN-25 was the most sophisticated encryption system in the world. He listened to Kuroda's theory with growing anger. When Kuroda finished, Masuda slammed his hand on the desk. The codes were not broken, he said. They could not be broken. Kuroda was suffering from the same defeatism that had infected weak officers since Midway. Such thinking was dangerous. Such thinking was disloyal. Kuroda should forget this nonsense and return to his duties before someone reported him to the military police. Kuroda bowed and left the office. He understood the danger. In Japan's military culture, questioning the system was worse than failure. Officers who admitted mistakes were punished. Officers who suggested that the Navy had made errors simply disappeared. But Kuroda could not forget what he had seen. Every night, he lay awake thinking about the men on those carriers. They had trusted that their commanders knew what they were doing. They had trusted that their communications were secure. And they had died in flames because someone, somewhere, was listening to every word Japan transmitted. He began keeping a private journal, recording his observations in a personal code. He was careful, always careful. But the pattern kept growing. Intelligence reports from other battles showed the same story. American submarines appeared on Japanese shipping routes that should have been secret. Enemy aircraft intercepted convoys at times when they should have been undetected. The coincidences were too many. The ghost was in the signals, hiding in plain sight. Weeks passed. The Navy prepared new operations, sent new orders, and continued using the same codes. Kuroda watched it all with growing horror. He was one man with a theory that no one wanted to hear. The war machine rolled forward, blind and proud, and he could not find a way to make it stop. But he knew that somewhere across the Pacific, American cryptanalysts were reading the same messages he processed every day. They knew Japan's plans. They knew Japan's secrets. And Japan, wrapped in its certainty, refused to believe that any enemy could be so clever. The ghost was patient. It had all the time in the world. And every day, more Japanese sailors sailed toward deaths that had already been predicted. The smell of burning oil never left Rabaul. It hung in the tropical air like a permanent stain, mixing with the rot of the jungle and the salt of the harbor where broken ships waited for repairs that would never come. This was where the survivors gathered, the men who had escaped the flames of Midway and now carried those flames inside their minds. Commander Takeshi Kuroda arrived in August 1942, traveling under orders that officially did not exist. Rear Admiral Seiyuki Hara had listened to his theory about the broken codes. Unlike Captain Masuda, Hara was a man who had seen too much death to care about protecting reputations. He had lost friends at Midway. He wanted answers. So he had sent Kuroda to Rabaul to interview the survivors, quietly, without attracting attention. If the codes were truly compromised, the Americans must never learn that Japan suspected the truth. Kuroda found the survivors scattered across the base, assigned to new ships or waiting in the hospital wards. Many did not want to talk. The Battle of Midway had lasted less than 2 days, but those 2 days had shattered something inside these men. They woke screaming from nightmares. They flinched at loud noises. The Navy called them heroes, but they saw themselves as ghosts who had somehow failed to die. A pilot named Lieutenant Tanaka told Kuroda about the morning of June 4. He had been in the air when the American dive bombers came. From above, he watched Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu explode almost simultaneously, 3 pillars of fire rising from the sea. The timing was impossible, he said. The Americans had caught all 3 carriers at the exact moment when their decks were loaded with armed aircraft. 5 minutes earlier or later, and the damage would have been far less. It was as if the enemy had known the Japanese schedule to the minute. A torpedo bomber crew described how American submarines had been waiting along their fleet's approach route. These waters should have been empty. The route had been classified at the highest level, discussed only in encrypted radio messages. Yet the submarines were there, patient and deadly, picking off escorts before the main battle even began, but it was a young radio operator named Lieutenant Kenji Ozawa who gave Kuroda the evidence he needed. Ozawa had served aboard the carrier Kaga, one of the 4 ships lost. He had been in the communications room when the attack began, and he had survived only because an explosion threw him into the sea. Now he sat in a hospital bed, his burns still healing, his eyes carrying a distance that would never fully close. Ozawa spoke slowly, as if each word cost him something. Minutes before the American bombers appeared, he had detected a strange signal. It was American, clearly, but it was using a frequency that should have been unknown to the enemy. More troubling, the signals seemed to be coordinating the attack, directing planes toward specific targets. Ozawa had reported this to his superiors, but in the chaos of battle, no one had listened. Afterward, no one had asked. Kuroda pressed him carefully. Was he certain about the frequency? Could he have been mistaken? Ozawa shook his head. He had spent 2 years studying American radio procedures. The frequency was part of a system that the Japanese Navy believed to be secret. The Americans should not have known it existed. Unless they were reading Japanese communications and learning things that were never meant to be shared. When Kuroda returned to Tokyo, he found that Captain Masuda had been busy. Rumors circulated that Kuroda was a defeatist, perhaps even a sympathizer with Western ideas. Colleagues who had once respected him now avoided his eyes. In the rigid hierarchy of the Imperial Navy, such whispers were more dangerous than enemy bullets. A man could survive combat and still be destroyed by politics. Kuroda understood what was happening. Masuda was fighting for his career. If the codes were broken, Masuda was responsible. He had assured the admirals that JN-25 was perfect. Now he needed to destroy the man who threatened to prove him wrong. It was not personal, not really. It was survival. In war, truth was often the first casualty, but in military bureaucracy, truth never had a chance at all. Admiral Hara called Kuroda to a private meeting. The evidence was strong enough, he said. It was time to present the findings to the Naval General Staff. Kuroda felt his chest tighten. This was what he had worked for, but it was also the most dangerous moment of his life. He would stand before the most powerful men in Japan and tell them that their greatest secrets were known to the enemy. Some would listen. Others would want him silenced. The date was set for September. Kuroda had less than a month to prepare his case. Somewhere across the Pacific, at a place called Station Hypo in Hawaii, American cryptanalysts continued their work, reading messages that Japanese officers believed were completely secure. The clock was ticking. Every day of delay meant more operations compromised, more sailors dying in ambushes they never saw coming, and in Tokyo, Captain Masuda polished his own weapons, preparing to strike. The room had no windows. Deep inside Imperial Naval Headquarters, far from any place where sunlight could reach, 12 men sat around a long table covered in green cloth. These were the masters of the Japanese Navy, admirals and captains who commanded fleets and decided the fates of nations. The air was thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of unspoken tension. Commander Takashi Kuroda stood at the end of the table, his report in his hands. He had rehearsed this moment for weeks, but now that it had arrived, his throat felt like sand. The faces before him were stone. Some looked curious. Others looked hostile. And at the far end, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto sat in shadow, his expression impossible to read. Yamamoto was the architect of Pearl Harbor, the most famous naval commander in Japan. His judgment would decide everything. Kuroda began with facts. He presented the intercepts, the testimony from Midway survivors, the pattern of impossible American knowledge. He spoke clearly and simply, letting the evidence build like a wall. When he reached the AF intercept, he saw a few admirals lean forward. This was the key. An American message using a Japanese code designation. There was no innocent explanation that he finished and waited. The silence stretched. Then Vice Admiral Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier fleet at Midway, slammed his palm on the table. This was outrageous, he declared. The defeat at Midway was caused by bad luck and American courage, not broken codes. Commander Kuroda was insulting the honor of the officers who had died. He was spreading panic when the Navy needed unity. Such behavior bordered on treason. Other voices joined the attack. How dare a mere commander accuse the intelligence division of failure? Who had authorized this investigation? Why was a junior officer wasting the time of the Naval General Staff with conspiracy theories? The room became a storm of accusations, each admiral trying to outdo the others in their fury. Captain Masuda rose to speak. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which made his words more devastating. He regretted to inform the assembled officers that Commander Kuroda had been under suspicion for some time. There were concerns about his mental stability following the Midway defeat. There were questions about his loyalty. Perhaps the commander had fabricated evidence to advance his own career, or perhaps he genuinely believed his delusions. Either way, he was clearly unfit for duty. Masuda suggested that the military police should investigate. Kuroda felt the floor shifting beneath him. Masuda was not just defending himself. He was destroying Kuroda's career, possibly his life. In wartime Japan, accusations of disloyalty could lead to prison, torture, death. The other officers were nodding. They wanted someone to blame, and Masuda was giving them an easy target, but then Admiral Yamamoto raised his hand, and the room fell silent instantly. He had not spoken since the meeting began. Now he looked directly at Kuroda, studying him with eyes that had seen every kind of war. When he spoke, his voice was soft, tired, carrying the weight of 4 lost carriers and 3,000 dead men. That he understood the concerns of his colleagues, Yamamoto said. He understood their anger. But he asked them to consider a simple question: what if Commander Kuroda was right? If the codes were secure, then changing them cost nothing but time. If the codes were broken, and Japan did nothing, then every operation would be compromised until the war ended. The enemy would always know. Japanese sailors would continue dying in ambushes. Was protecting pride worth more than protecting lives? The room stirred uneasily. Yamamoto's logic was impossible to dismiss, but admitting that the codes might be broken meant admitting failure at the highest level. Some officers shook their heads. Others looked at their hands. The silence returned, heavier than before. Finally, the Chief of Naval Staff spoke. A full code change was too drastic, he said. It would cause chaos throughout the fleet. But as a precaution, the Navy would implement partial modifications to the JN-25 system. This was a compromise, a middle path. It satisfied no one, but it ended the meeting. Kuroda was not arrested. He was not court-martialed. Instead, he received new orders that night. He was being transferred to the Guangdong Army staff in Manchuria, effective immediately. It was a polite way of removing him from the war without the scandal of punishment. He would spend the rest of the conflict counting supplies in frozen warehouses while the Pacific burned. Captain Masuda shook his hand before he left. There was no malice in Masuda's eyes, only the cold satisfaction of a man who had won. The system had protected itself. The truth had been acknowledged just enough to be safely ignored. Kuroda boarded a transport plane at dawn. Below him, Tokyo spread out gray and unaware. Somewhere in that city, officers were sending orders on codes they believed were secret. And somewhere across the ocean, patient listeners were writing down every word. Winter came early to Manchuria. By October, the wind carried ice from the steppes, and the sky turned the color of old iron. Commander Takeshi Kuroda sat in a small office at the Guangdong Army Supply Depot, surrounded by inventory lists and shipping manifests. Outside his window, frozen fields stretched toward a horizon that held nothing but more cold. This was his war now. Counting boxes. Checking numbers. Waiting for news from a Pacific that no longer wanted him. Letters arrived from old colleagues, carefully worded to avoid censorship but clear enough in their meaning. The partial code modifications had been implemented, just as the Naval General Staff ordered. For a few weeks, it seemed the changes might work. American forces appeared less certain, their ambushes less precise. But by November, the pattern returned. Convoys were intercepted. Submarines waited at secret rendezvous points. Aircraft carriers launched strikes against targets they should not have known existed. The cryptanalysts at Station HYPO in Hawaii had adapted. They were the best in the world, men like Joseph Rockefort who treated Japanese codes as puzzles to be solved. The partial changes had slowed them down, nothing more. Within weeks, they were reading JN-25 again, following Japanese naval movements in near real time. American commanders planned their operations around information that came straight from Tokyo's own dispatches. The ghost in the signals was stronger than ever. Kuroda received a letter from Lieutenant Kenji Ozawa in December. It was short, written in the careful handwriting of a man who had learned to hide his emotions. Ozawa had recovered from his burns and been assigned to a new ship, the cruiser Kumano. He was sailing again, back into the war that had already tried to kill him once. He wrote that he thought of Kuroda often. He believed Kuroda had been right about the codes. Perhaps, Ozawa wrote, the truth was like a seed. It took time to grow, even in soil that did not want it. He hoped they would meet again after the war. Kuroda kept the letter in his desk. He read it when the loneliness became too heavy. Ozawa had understood. That was something. One person, at least, had seen what Kuroda had tried to show them all. In February 1943, the news came through official channels, stripped of emotion, reduced to facts. The cruiser Kumano had been attacked by American aircraft during operations near Guadalcanal. The attackers had appeared without warning, striking from angles that the ship's defenses had not anticipated. The damage was severe. Many crew members were killed. Among the dead was Lieutenant Kenji Ozawa, communications officer. Kuroda read the report 3 times. Then he walked outside into the Manchurian cold and stood in the snow until he could no longer feel his hands. Ozawa had survived the sinking of Kaga, had survived his burns, had survived the nightmares that followed him from Midway. He had earned a second chance at life. And the war had taken him anyway, killed by the same pattern that Kuroda had tried to expose. More reports followed in the months ahead. The Battle of the Bismarck Sea, where American bombers destroyed an entire Japanese convoy because they knew exactly when and where it would be. Operation Vengeance, where American fighters intercepted Admiral Yamamoto's transport plane over the Solomon Islands and killed him, because codebreakers had read the message announcing his flight schedule. Each tragedy confirmed what Kuroda had warned. The enemy was listening. The enemy knew everything. And Japan kept transmitting, kept dying, kept refusing to admit the truth. Captain Masuda received a promotion. The Naval General Staff continued their meetings. New ships were built and new sailors trained. The war ground on, burning through lives like a fire through dry grass. In Tokyo, proud men told themselves that Japan's spirit would overcome any disadvantage. They could not accept that their greatest weapon had become their greatest weakness. Kuroda remained in Manchuria until the war ended. He never returned to signals intelligence. He never testified about what he had discovered. The official histories would mention the breaking of JN-25 as a minor factor in the war, not the catastrophic failure it truly was. Pride demanded silence, and silence was maintained. Years later, when the documents were finally declassified, the world learned what had happened. American codebreakers had been reading Japanese communications since before Pearl Harbor. Every major operation, every secret movement, every classified order had been known to the enemy. The advantage had decided battles, shortened the war, saved countless American lives. And on the other side of the ledger, Japanese sailors had died by the thousands, killed by knowledge they never knew was stolen. Kuroda lived into old age. He never spoke publicly about his experience. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he would take out Ozawa's letter and read it again. The truth was like a seed, Ozawa had written. It took time to grow. Perhaps that was true. Perhaps one day, the lessons would be learned. But for the men who had sailed into ambushes, who had trusted their commanders, who had believed their secrets were safe, the truth had come too late. The ghost in the signals had claimed them all.